Genesis chapter 11. Let's turn please to Genesis chapter 11 as we continue our survey of the book of Genesis. We've talked, of course, about Genesis chapter 1 through 3, the creation, chapter 3, the fall, and then we talked about Cain and Abel, and we talked about Noah and the flood. We discussed the ark and the flood, and then the waters receding, and now we've come to chapter 11, the dispersion of the nations, the dispersion of the people. When God created Adam and Eve, He gave them a command to be fruitful and to multiply and to fill the earth. It was not God's design that man build cities and live in them and pile up themselves, live like pigeons in roosts. He wanted man to spread out and to fill the earth and to enjoy all of His creation. But we know that as man began to fill the earth, that man's imagination was only evil continually. And God said, I'm not going to put up with it anymore. And so he decided to bring a flood to cleanse the earth, to destroy mankind. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And so God appeared to Noah and told him to build an ark, to build a box. We talked about that. And Noah, his wife, his sons and his sons' wives would all gather in the ark and would be saved from the flood. So they were in the ark, they had the animals there, and 40 days and 40 nights the rain came, the floods came up, the water was upon the earth, and then after 40 days and 40 nights everything calmed down, the rain stopped, but the water was still there. And it took days and days and days and months and months and months, and it was a year by the time they finally came out of the ark. And then God gave them the command again, the same command, to be fruitful, to multiply, and to fill the earth. And so they're there in Turkey, and they began to migrate. And what we see as we come to chapter 11 is they have not been obedient. Chapter 11, verse 1. The whole earth had a common language and a common vocabulary. When the people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Then they said to one another, Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick instead of stone and tar instead of mortar. Then they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered across the face of the earth. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the people had started building. And the Lord said, If as one people, all sharing a common language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be beyond them. Come, let's go down and confuse their language so they won't be able to understand each other. So the Lord scattered them there across the face of the entire earth, and they stopped building the city. And that is why its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the entire world, and from there the Lord scattered them across the face of the entire earth. Now in verse 1 we see that the whole earth had one language and one speech. And the interesting thing is that they're all traveling together. Remember, the ark came to rest on Mount Ararat in Turkey, in northern Turkey. And they have traveled from northern Turkey all the way down around into what we call the Fertile Crescent, the plain of Shinar, the plain that is between the Tigris and Euphrates River. They're still all together. Now, God wanted them to travel, but He wanted them to travel separately, to spread out. But instead, they've all migrated together south, and they've come down to the plain of Shinar, and they've decided that this is a nice place to settle. And so they're all there, and they all have one language and one speech. That speech, that means vocabulary. They all speak with the same words. They all have the same set of words. You know how we speak English, and the British speak English, and the Australians speak English, and the people in Singapore speak English, and the people in Malaysia speak English, and all of these people speak the same language, but we don't have the same vocabulary, do we? We have different words for the same thing. We use words differently. There's a variety, and there's choice, and there's a beauty in that distinctiveness. They didn't have that. They all had the same language. They all spoke the same words. They all said the same things. And you know, there's a connection between the language you use and the ideas you have, between the way that you speak and the way that you think. And it's fascinating to look through history at how people's languages influence their thought and their cultures. And these people, they all had one language, one speech, one vocabulary. There was no room for diversity of thought, of idea, of communication, of the beauty of language among them. And here they are, they've been disobedient, they've traveled together, they've arrived together, and they're all speaking and thinking the same things. But now that they've arrived at Shinar, it's a nice plain, it's an easy place to live, it's well watered, you've got 2 rivers, one on either side. It's a nice area, and so they decide that they want to settle there, and they come up with this delusional ambition. They said, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. Then they said, come and let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. They decided to stop and build themselves a city. It's fascinating that the first 2 cities we see being built in the Scripture are built in rebellion against God. God told Cain, you're going to be a wanderer and a vagabond on the earth. And Cain said, oh yeah, watch me. And he went out eastward toward Nod and he built a city. And here we see God told these people to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And they said, we don't want to be separated. We want to build a city so we can all live together in one spot, in one place. They decided to build a city and to build a tower. They said, we're going to make a tower with its top in the heavens. They decided that they were going to work their way to heaven. That through their own efforts, through their own knowledge and ability, through their own technology, this idea of making bricks is a brand new technology in this area. Up until this time, as they've traveled, they've used wood, they've used natural stone, but there is not much wood in Shinar, there is not much stone in Shinar, so they have developed this technology to make bricks. And this allows them to make multi-story buildings, which they could not do before. They said, let's use our technology, let's use our intelligence, let's use our wisdom, let's use our ideas, let's use our unity to build our way up into our own paradise, to build our way to heaven. And they said, and we will make a name for ourselves. They said, and we will build our own identity. We are going to decide who we are. We are going to decide what we're called. We're going to decide what we're known for. We're going to decide our own identity. They decided to find their own way to heaven and to create their own identity. God, our identity, we need to remember that our identity is found in our Creator. Our identity is found in our Redeemer. And these people decided that they were going to reject God's will for their lives. They were going to reject God's commandments. They were going to establish their own way and their own identity. As they began to build what they're building here, this tower. Now, if you look at the medieval paintings and pictures and the Renaissance pictures, the pictures from Europe of this passage, you see these round towers going up. You know, these round European towers. Well, they weren't building round towers. They didn't know how to build round towers. They were building what are called ziggurats, these stepped pyramid sort of things. And they were building, the one that they built here, they built in 7 steps or 7 layers for the sun, moon, and each of the planets that they happen to know about. And they were going to build this up, but we know that they failed to reach heaven because God had to come down to see what they were doing. They were trying to build up to God, and God came down to see what they were doing. In verse 5, but the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the people started building. And the Lord said, if as one people, all sharing a common language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be beyond them. Come, let's go down and confuse their language so they won't be able to understand each other. God said they've got one language, they've got one thought process, they're single-minded, and whatever they put their mind to, that's what they're going to be tenacious, that's what they're going to stick to. They're never going to obey me on their own. Come on, we're going to go and we're going to confuse their language. We're going to break up their communication, and we're going to cause them to separate. And so God came down and he confused the language. So it seems like our understanding is that each family, there's Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and you go to chapter 10 and we see their sons. Of course, chapter 10 happens after chapter 11. Chapter 10 is a result of chapter 11, the Table of Nations. But the Shem, Ham, and Japheth have their sons, and then their sons have their sons, and these families become the nations of the earth, the people of the earth. So what would have happened is that they all had this one language, and God shattered that language like you shatter a mirror. And so each family group had a piece of it that it altered for them. They began to speak in a different way and think in a different way, and they could not communicate with the people they were working with. And this lack of communication led to a lack of cooperation, and it led to a desire to travel, to split up, to disperse. And that's what God wanted them to do. God wanted them to disperse. It is God's desire and God's design that men spread all over the earth and that they live different ways. They have different cultures. They express themselves with different words. They use different languages. One of the most beautiful things we see in the book of Revelation is that there are people from every tribe and nation and language who are worshiping God. There are people with every color of skin, people who have spoken every language on earth, people who have lived in every corner of the globe, bringing glory to God in their own languages and with their own thoughts and ideas and their own culture. They are rejoicing and praising the Lord. And that's the beauty that God desires. We know that God is a God of diversity. It's very easy just to look out at nature and see that. And God desired that we be spread abroad, that we have different ideas and different cultures and different language. And so this is how he brought it about. Babel in Hebrew means confusion. And so they say that that is why the city of Babylon, the city of Babel, was called confusion. Now we understand that Hebrew developed through the years, and so this would have been a root word from that original language. Now the Babylonians, the people of Babylon, they said that their name means gate of heaven, which would fit with the idea of the tower, wouldn't it? But the thing about it is that Babel is not a natural Babylonian word. It's a borrowed word. We don't know what language it was borrowed from, but it doesn't fit. You know how there are words in English that are different because we borrowed them from other languages? Well, we can tell that the word Babel is not a natural Babylonian language. It doesn't fit their grammar. But they have assigned to it the meaning gate of heaven, because that's what their idea of Babylon was, of building this tower, of being a gate to heaven. Now we have evidence that this story is true. We have evidence that that these people spread all over the earth, because this story is spread all over the earth. There are Tower of Babel stories in cultures that cannot build towers. There are Tower of Babel stories in places like, I have them listed, some of them listed here. We have Babylonian Tower of Babel stories. We have Assyrian Tower of Babel stories. We have Mesoamerican from Central America. They had Tower of Babel stories. Southwest American natives from Arizona have stories about the Tower of Babel. Multiple Southern African people, Botswana, Tanzania, places like this, they had stories. They build mud huts, but they had stories of a tower that reached into heaven. Nepal, Myanmar, or Burma, and Polynesian people had Tower of Babel stories that predated any contact with the Bible or Westerners. So this all had to come from one event, from one story. And it's fascinating that not only do we have stories, but we have towers. The ziggurat is found in Polynesia. It's found in South America, the Mayans, the Aztecs. It's found in Egypt. It's found in South Africa. It's found in North Africa. It's found in central, in the plains of Shinar. It's found in China. Is one of the basic structures that every culture starts out with. This stepped pyramid, this stepped tower. But then we have Nebuchadnezzar's own words. When Nebuchadnezzar was king in Babylon, well, his father had started it and then he finished it. There was this unfinished tower in the middle of the city. And his father cleaned off the foundation, tore everything down, and started over. And Nebuchadnezzar built the tower. It was called the Tower of Etemenanke. I have no idea if I pronounced that correctly, but that's what it says. And in this tower, in the foundation of this tower, archaeologists found this cylinder. And it was written all over with cuneiform. And it was written, it's an inscription of Nebuchadnezzar II. And here's the translation of it. This is what Nebuchadnezzar said about the tower about this tower. A former king built the temple of the seven lights of the earth, but he did not complete its top or its head. Since a remote time, people had abandoned it without order expressing their words. Since that time, earthquakes and lightning had dispersed its sun-dried clay, the bricks of the casing had split, and the earth of the interior had been scattered in heaps. So this is Nebuchadnezzar's description of the tower that he has torn down and is going to build again. It's a tower that had been built in ancient times but abandoned because the people without order could not express their words. So there is strong evidence for the truth of this, apart from the fact that the Bible says it and so we believe it. But what I found fascinating was just the idea that man from the very beginning has wanted to make his own way to heaven. That man from the very beginning has wanted to establish his own identity apart from God. That man from the very beginning has wanted to conform and be like every other person. Everybody says, oh, I want to be individual. I want to express myself. But the fact is that everybody expresses their individuality in the exact same way. Everybody does crazy things, but they all do the same crazy things. Humanity, it's a human desire to express conformity and to be just like everyone else. And God says, that's not what I designed you for. That's not what I created you for. That's not my plan for you, to be the same as everybody else, to live in the same city and have the same tower and speak the same language and express yourself in the same way. My desire for you is to be different, is to live differently, is to speak differently, is to worship me as an individual. He had to scatter these people to accomplish this. Let's remember in our lives that it's God's desire that we worship Him in the way that He has created.